All right, so we're going to talk about the searching part of URL scan. As I mentioned in the overview in the other video, I wanted to separate this out mainly because I find that it's probably one of the more underutilized parts of URL scan, yet one of its more important ones. Too often this is approached as if this is a Google search or a Bing search kind of field that you can throw keywords in, and it indeed will respond in some ways to that kind of blind searching, but it really shines when you guide it, when you give it the right fields and keywords to look in, and you actually begin to find what you're looking for when you do that. In fact, they know this, which is why if you click help here, they give you some examples and try to break it out for you. And indeed, they kind of bulleted out some of the top things so that you can know how to search. Probably one of the first things they tell you is that, hey, their backend is an Elasticsearch database and that it's expecting a certain kind of query. And you can go follow that link if you'd like. I'm not going to do that today. And it kind of talks about how you can set up queries there. But really, everything you need is here on the page. And that's what a lot of these sub-bullets are. They're repeats of what you're going to find there, thankfully in a more digestible way, which is kind of cool. But key thing is you can make very complex searches and you can really hone in on what you want to find with a little care. And they try to help you out a little bit by showing you what some of those searches look like. But before I do that, I want to follow this link here. So under Search API Reference, it's going to actually give you all the fields that are being displayed here. I know when I first saw URLScan show up in 2020, that wasn't immediately apparent, and I really love that they added this in. It's one of the better kind of search things they can do. So let's follow this Search API Reference link here, because you can come back here at any time and see the fields that you can use when you perform searches. And it's kind of important to understand that each one of these fields focuses on a different part of what you're looking at, because the whole reason you came to URLScan is you want to understand how the domain or URL in focus interacted with the environment that is URLScan and how it, like, for example, pulled resources, what resources it were pulled, when it did it, what the original URL was, you know, and so on and so on. There's a lot of parts inside of URLScan that you can use to understand how that page not only resolved, but also how it calls resources, which can be very useful in finding malicious activity or negative activity or just understanding what is interacting with your network. And so there's a lot of things you can do here. Kind of like with VirusTotal, it has a lot of complexity. Unlike VirusTotal, which hides a lot of that complexity behind a paywall, URLScan is very nice in that they keep it visible to us and allow us to interact with it at a very good pace, both in the browser like we're going to do today or through their API. And each parts of the API fields you see here lets you talk to or at least search in different portions of what that URL did or what that resource did when you called it. And so everything from some pieces that are just kind of part of URLScans like the time and so on, to elements about the resource or the domain you fed it. So if you fed it a URL, or you fed it a domain, it will resolve its IP, it'll do all the DNS steps. So in resolution of its IP, it'll also figure out what its AS number is, what the AS name is, what the keywords are, and I'll talk about keywords here in a second, as well as country and domain and so on. It has all these basic fields that it's going to fill out, and then it really gets into the details about the page and its AS name and so on, and then some stats, which are kind of useful, and then you're going to see another one here called task, and I'm going to separate these out for you. I'm not going to talk about brand, which is this bottom part, because you can see it's locked behind a paywall. That's definitely useful, but kind of beyond the scope today. But I do want to touch on just a few items before we go do some fun searching. So page versus task. So if you've looked at the overview, you've used URLScan, you'll see, in fact, I'll just back up and we'll do one together here. So you see here, this is one of the just random, like if you want to do a blind searching, just do an asterisk and get anything. But let's follow this particular link. And you can see here, it has in its structure a submitted URL and an effective URL. And that comes after a series of resolutions. And you can see the full URL chain right here. They kindly put it off to the side, or you'll see it in one of the other tabs as we talked about in the overview, so I won't repeat too much there. But if you look, this was the actual URL that was fed. This is the task URL that was given. And then it made some resolutions before it got to this effective or final URL. So if you want to pick out and only look at things that were tasks, like that initial URL that was provided, you can by looking in the task part of the fields. We'll back up again, back up one more time. I should probably just open this up in another tab. Let's go ahead and do that. And here we are. So if you're interested in only looking at the URLs that were provided by someone and searching there for like your domain of interest or a reference or a text piece that you're trying to track down as part of your research, you want to use the task fields because that's what's going to be contained in there. That way you can automatically exclude everything that's not in that original tasking. And that can be useful if you're looking for point of spear or tip of the spear or the point of the front end of some kind of phishing campaign or the front end of interactions. You want to look at things that were just part of the task piece because that's what was originally submitted. Then that's going to be the field for you. Otherwise, you're going to want to stay here in the page side. And those are pages that were resolved during the pursuit of running that task. And so just like that previous reference here had several links, like this would be the task field that you would look up in if you only wanted to see that. This would be the domain, which would also include potentially some of the submitted. It's kind of broader, if you will. So domain, just to clarify this, because I'm kind of meandering a little bit, excuse me. If you search on domain, you're literally broadly searching over any URL in any fashion that URLScan has resolved. If you really want to focus in on what the final or more effective domain was, like this one, then you want to use page.domain primarily. If you want to look at the task domain, the very first URL task domain that came in, you'd want to use task. So domain will broadly look everywhere. Task.domain will look at the domain of a URL that was submitted. Page.domain will look at more of the effective URL, the URLs in between, in case it did a couple different redirects. So you can kind of look in different ways. So if you just want a big, broad net, you want to cast a giant net, use domain. If you want to get more focused in on different parts of what happened, then you either use page.domain or task.domain. And you can indeed go domain, page, and task and do searching, though it's really hard to get good results that way. And you can kind of dig in there. Now there's some sub pieces here. You'll see it even goes down to a keyword. You can look by country. Any of those are fine. The nice thing about what URLScan is trying to tell you is that it's really separated and you can concatenate or segment off different pieces and ask for a resolution that's a little more complex than just, hey, show me this domain. So like if you wanted to get, I guess I'll just go through the examples that might be simplest. So this one right here, as it says, this is non-empty scans in the last 7 days. So you can see here, it's doing standard nomenclature. So it determines now, which is the present time, minus 7 days, and gives you only those results. Using time bound is really important. If we only want to look at like 1 day's worth of results, we could do that as well. And if you look down here, you'll see it still gave you 10,000 of them, but it did everything it did in the last 30 seconds or so. And then it just comes page after page after page of results. Because really we're asking broadly, any page that resolved, right? Something that didn't come back as an empty scan. And that's like the biggest net out there. So let's zoom this in a little bit more and not say that. If you wanted to look at like one IP, give me everything that resolved for this IP. I'm just taking one from down below. And this is gonna probably come up with nothing because a 0, 0 is not a very good thing to look at. So let's do a different one here. We had a 45, 170. So nothing in the last day. How about ever? Nothing ever. That works. So you could play with this and, for example, do that or other items. Doesn't really matter. We'll get into page IP here in a second. We'll just do it. So like here's a better example. This says, give me this IP. So you see here, this is a site or a /16 and not this one particular IP that I was trying to find. And does a date bound for 2018 to 2019. Let's make this 2020, 2021. We're still getting hits 6 months ago. So I'm looking inside a whole /16 and I'm excluding one IP. That's the complexity here. So I'm read this as one group. So page IP, I want everything out of this AS, but not this particular one IP. And I want it from the dates of 2020 to 2021. So that's kind of how that works. So you can get into some semi-complex querying here. And I'm really looking in the page.ip. So if you remember from before, page is the end result. So if I wanted to make this task IP, I could change this to task. I don't know if I'd get anything. Nah, it doesn't get anything. page.ip, and I'm back in business. So you have to understand which one you're looking at to make sure you're focused as well as possible. It's probably not so much that there isn't any scans there, but that it's an unlikely task result. This would be better changed to a different IP range to get anything effective out of there. But I don't want to get too deep because I want to keep this kind of as an overview for searching. I'll do a more detailed run through how to do like very focused searching here in another video. But, so page.url, this one's kind of interesting. So page, again, if you remember earlier, that's the end result page. Now we're asking for the URL, so we're asking for the resolution, so that URL that was provided, not the domain, which would be just the domain, but the actual whole URL. We're asking for the keyword. So keyword's kind of fun. Keyword is the URL, the primary page, but one thing you need to remember about keyword is after it resolves something, it creates a keyword for the domain, and it kind of stores it. And if you look here, you'll see that it says, hey, you got to give me a keyword. You can't just give me a text. That's why back here you have regex. And if you caught that there, they're not. And then you have like a regex for anything. And it says, hey, look, a keyword is the primary domain analyzed as a keyword, which is, to me, when I first read it, I'm like, what does that mean? So remember, it's storing things as like power words, as keywords. And those, in this case, is going to resolve as a domain. So if you want to find page.domain.keyword, it stepped through, say, 10 redirects on its way to get to that final domain, it's going to save each one of those as a keyword. And so if you wanted to look for that, you could, and you'll see here it gives you back a list of PayPals of different kinds, right? Because we're saying, hey, we want one with the keyword of PayPal. And indeed here, this was the task domain that got sent. Here is the effective URL, and here's the chain that it went through to get there. And you can see in this chain you have paypal.com. So it's going to find it as a keyword and actually give it back to you. Now if I wanted to be, and you can see here that it kind of explains it a little differently. It says domain was contacted but isn't the primary page or primary domain. It's saying the same thing. The end domain was something different potentially, and PayPal was in there. Oop, I jumped ahead of one. Sorry, let's go to this one. This one we're saying, hey, show me all the domains that are paypal.com but aren't actually page.domain or the final resolving domain. And you can see we get a different list. And we can follow these. I'm getting ahead of myself there. This is a malicious page, of course. So here's the short link that was submitted. It goes through a series of resolutions, which you can come over here and look at the URL history. It gives you the redirect chain. It gives you the page URL history as well. And in here, you're like, I don't see PayPal, even though that's kind of what I searched for. So if you back up or hit the return, if you look in your HTTP transactions, you're going to find PayPal. In fact, it's right there. Because we gave it a regex, it's going to find any match to PayPal. So they did indeed call a PayPal object, which is why we got a match. And they did it down here again with the logo. Okay, let's get back to searching here. So we've just done this PayPal example to give us kind of an overview of what you can do. And again, this is looking in the domain that we requested. If you recall, I broke down just a second ago that you have basically three parts here, domain being one of them and task being another. The majority of your searching is going to be around either domain, which would be very broad and include everything, or page.domain, which would be the end result. So in this case, we're looking very broadly for kind of, again here, paypal.com, but not where it was the final domain. And it kind of explains it down here. You know, domain was contacted, right? It's in the was contacted in some fashion, but isn't actually the page or primary domain, which is a great use of using that broad net. So broadly, you're saying, hey, PayPal was contacted at any point. Doesn't matter when in the process, but it wasn't actually the end result of the primary domain. I want to know now what that is, and you could concatenate and add more on there. But before I get into that one, I want to talk about some fuzzy searching here with exclusion, which is what this fun one is. So again, page.domain, final domain contacted was paypal.com in this case. You'll see they have a tilde here, so they're doing a fuzzy match on PayPal in any kind of combination. And if you look down here, you'll see you've got paypal.ch, you've got hpaypal.com, you've got this longer one that's tpaypal, ePaypal, and so on. You're getting a fuzzy match to PayPal in some fashion, whether that extra piece is included inside, like this one here, paypal, spaypal.com, or is at the front spaypal.com. So it's kind of a great way to look broadly around a domain with a little bit of fuzziness. And then make sure, in this case, like they did, and not. So you can see it talks about your logic here. So I want every end result resolution of a domain that was paypal.com that wasn't actually paypal.com. And you can see here it talks about it. And if we search, you see that we have this. Let's look at one of these. This is part page, or at least that's what it presents at. Even it tells us it's a phishing page. So you can see here the task domain, the URL given was this 38k paypal.com. And of course it passed a little sublink here. And somewhere in here, it resolves PayPal. And we can look through here. I'm lazy, so let's just do a quick search. And we'll see that it constantly hits this PayPal piece. And we kind of get a few items in there. So again, not paypal.com, but actually is a fuzzy match to paypal.com. Great way to kind of find phishing more than anything else. You can also, this fuzzy search one here. The other way is to kind of regex, which is another way to do this. So same principle, it's like and not paypal.com, we'll start at the end. But I want to look in any page.domain and get any kind of asterisk response. So I'm looking for anything. So remember here, you're sending a regex, and in a regex, a period means any character, and an asterisk means to continue to match. And so really we're asking for any PayPal-like structure, which is why you're seeing PayPal objects, PayPal's.top, and then you have PayPal.com.cn. You're going to get not a fuzzy match, but a match that at the end of it can literally be anything and go for pretty much as far as it will go, which is why you get some of these really long ones here. So PayPal, you see the structure PAYP is what we're asking for, and we're looking in there with regex for any domain that kind of matches. Now this is such a big return. If I wanted to make sure and be good and kind of say, hey, I really only want to see things in the last minute, I can do this, which you'll see. It's supposed to be like 1 minute. I got everything under a couple hours. Now, minus 1 minute. Oh, no. About 1 day. Relative query. I got the same thing. Huh. The 1M didn't look like I thought it would. Yeah, that's fine. Let's check it out here. Oh, didn't work there either. Same thing. Not really excluding down past that. It's giving me like the last 1 day. Okay, that's something to chase down. And if that's a flaw, I'll send a bug request and ask them. So the point here is you can kind of break down the timeline, and it does give you at least the last 30 seconds and so forth, which is kind of nice. So I'm going to copy this as I continue to meander my way through this. We were talking about regex, and you see we get a million results literally. So let's do that so that we can look at some that just happened. I'm trying to change this to H. Never tried. Yeah, you can. Okay, here's the last hour. So which is kind of more what I was looking for, like what just recently happened. So here we get our PayPal matches. So not PayPal, but has something similar. And we see that this did not resolve. So that first search I had done, which says, hey, show me things that didn't resolve, this would be one way to find it. Actually, I think I just said the reverse of it. This one here, non-empty scan. So this is, I know I meant to bring this up, but this is an example of an empty scan. So this was the task URL that was sent. It went out, it did its contacting, but nothing came back. So it's an empty result. You can see it's been scanned twice, which is kind of neat in the last hour. Now this one came back with a result. At least it looks like it. Verdict, looks like it broke down. That's weird. A few minutes later, it's not available. Screenshot. Okay. Sorry, I get interested in things. It's the downside of this. You can really go down the rabbit hole. Okay, so here you see we use domain and not page domain. You can go through some of these other ones, but here's the IP. We did this one already. If you want to search by AS, which I'm not going to right now, that's a big broad one. You really want to get into the URL for a second, and then we'll talk about file name here. So this is a more complex one, just to break it down. So page.url. So again, page is the result page. In the URL that it ended up at, I want to look at this string. Now, if you go back to reference, you'll see page.url has to be given text. That's why I keep this open. It's really handy to go back and forth. Because if you feed something that wants a keyword text, it's going to fail, and it may not tell you. In fact, it won't tell you. So, like keyword page.status, it wants an HTTP status code. That's a keyword. So you're going to have to give it a 200 or 404, that kind of number as a keyword back, or it's just not going to work. Just keep that in mind. In this case, I'm looking in the end result URL, and I want to know if it had this in the structure of the URL that was sent. And so when we did our search here, you see here, we get RenCore products.governance, and we looked for, just to be clear, WP content.uploads. Now, to make sure that we're finding it properly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave that on there, and I'm going to remove the file name because I don't want to stem this yet. I don't want an OR yet. Just want to find ones that are going to give me an example of where in the page.url WP content uploads is present. And at a glance you can see right there, it's actually in the URL that was submitted and in the final URL that was there. See it right there. And you can see it got a screenshot and it tells us that it's present. Here. So it's in all of these. Now you notice that when we put for file name, we get a lot more back. So if this is the end result URL has this in it, this is saying file name or a sub-resource has it in it as well. And we can actually remove this front end and use that as our example. So let's look at www.trafeline.com. Now you're like, I don't see it here. You're right. But you probably see it over here. And if you look, you will. See our WP content. So it's there, but it's in the resource at this point. So WP content uploads, just to go back and make sure. So if we look for it, it is indeed right here. Now that's a sub-resource. That's why it's in file name defined. So if you're interested in finding something like this, you need to use file name to look at it broadly like we just did. If you want to find that resource exactly, you would click on it here, or like if I wanted to find everything that had that call, you'll see it fed it file name and then a name. You could also feed that as a hash as well. So if I click this here, you'll see it has a resource hash. If I click it, I'm going to get the exact same thing because that's the hashed version of that text. All right. So file name will give you access to like resources or items that are called, and of course the date breaks it from now minus 1 minute, which gives us more than 1 minute, but that's fine. There's something wrong there. And here's another one. You can actually just use the hash and just look up things by hash. And of course, if you're curious where, so when you go to the HTTP transactions, if you hit the hourglass, or sorry, the little icon over there, whose name I can't remember. If you click the icon, it'll give you the resource hash, which is a hash equivalent to that resource. Sometimes it'll be a hash of text, sometimes it'll be a hash of the actual file that's there or whatnot. And you can then search on those, just like you can pretty much anything else. So if I wanted to find like every Modernizer 2.8.3 script that matches this, I could hit this sub item and click resource hash, and then it's going to find all those for me. So, all right. That kind of digs into this a little bit, but there's a couple things I really want to go back and touch on. So we'll go back to page.url. Remember, page end result. So if I wanted to limit this to only the task domain. We'll change this to task. And then it's only going to give me the original URL that was submitted that had WP-content uploads in. And it would exclude ones that didn't necessarily have it in the final page.domain. Now, it doesn't mean it wouldn't be there. I bet if I click this one, it would show up. Yeah, it does. But that's not always going to be the case. We're only looking in this area to make our match, which can be incredibly useful. Again, if you're trying to find phishing, where you have a URL string that you know is showing up in email or on a site or online or whatever, and you're trying to find that text, that more front-end piece of the attack, to match it to where it's going, where it's being redirected to, where other infrastructure is, and you want to use this to figure that out. So in many cases, it won't be a separate item. It'll resolve the same, but sometimes it won't. Like here's one. Let's check this out. So even though the end result was Bing, this is the submitted URL. If you had just done a page.domain search, you may not have found this, wal11.com. And indeed, even here, it's not showing up as the original one. This one will be the same way. Yeah, that's quick. Okay. There's your update. That's an image, it looks like. And you can kind of continue to clean this up and concatenate, add more. Definitely. You can even go show me this part of the task and show me, let's see if we can get this to work, and page.url, right? And of course it's text, so I'm going to surround it with double quotes if that wasn't very obvious. And I want to say, okay, I only want to see where the page.url also has content uploads, and not. There we go. So now I'm like, okay, where the task URL has it, but the page URL did not. I want to see those. Let me get this one here. Let's take a look at this one. So it had it, but it did not have it in the effective URL. So again, I'm looking for WP content in the submitted URL, the one that was tasked, but I don't want to find it in the final effective URL, the one that it actually resolved to. That can give you a sense on, okay, something called what looks like a regular resource, but actually resulted in, like in this case, a malicious one that just happened. That can be a great way to track things down. Let's take a look at, oh, there's our friend again. Let's look at this proxy here. So kproxy servlet. Somewhere in there is that uploads. There it is, WP content uploads right there. But it's not in the final. It came back with it invalid. Okay, that might be useful. Let's look at one more here. W3 and 3N. Not this one. Just because it looks interesting. So lazy admin, Netherlands. There. It's in WP, there it is in the original, but not in the final. It came back with this and it managed your content privacy update. So you can catch things like this as well. You could further go on and on and on and continue to separate and exclude and really hone in. This can kind of expand as far as you want. One thing I will say is try to, like everything, try to keep to the left the most important thing. It's less, there's no like short-circuiting in Elasticsearch query strings that I know of, but to me, just from a standpoint of logic, I try to keep the thing I want to find first on the left, and then in declining levels of zeroing in on what I want as I go to the right, and generally keep all my time bounds and stuff as the far right when it comes to this. If I had short-circuiting capability where a match or no match would actually short-circuit or shut down what I'm looking for, then I would put everything that I thought would match, that would make the match fail, to the far left. But that's a whole different thing. Right now, you want to make everything that's going to match. Like I start with, I want to see it in this place and not in another one, and I want to see that. You can kind of reorganize it however you want, but that's my suggestion. So here's a semi-meandering, but hopefully useful walkthrough of different ways to search on URLScan using the actual in-browser search capability. Hopefully you find it useful. I'll try to take some time and break this down with some soundbite locations so you can jump to it real easy. So look in the description and the contents for where I mentioned different things. Thanks.